Hey y'all, what's up? My name is Jess. Welcome back to my greenhouse here at Roots and Refuge Farm. Today we are talking about seed varieties. Now this video is one of my most requested videos throughout the year. So many people ask, do you have a list of your must grow varieties, your favorite varieties? And last year I did not make one of these videos. I did the year before. And last year I meant to throughout the winter, and then as I was kind of preparing to, all the stuff started to unfold with COVID, and of course I didn't want to add any strain to seed companies, which were really struggling to keep up with the mass amount of orders they were getting. And this year we're actually seeing a little bit of that still. So on the front end, I kind of want to preface, I'm going to share these are my tried and true varieties, and I'm saying they're my must grow. I'm using language like these will always be in my garden, but last year some of these were not in my garden because I didn't have seeds and I couldn't source seeds. And this year, I think I have seeds for most of these, but there may be a few instances of the varieties I'm talking about today that I don't even have seeds for this year. Basically, what I'm just trying to get across here is that these are varieties that I've tried, I've grown multiple times, and I just want to tell you what I liked about them. Get a cup of coffee and get comfortable. We'll probably be here for a minute. This is one of those topics that I love to talk about. It's something that before I had my YouTube platform, I felt really alone in, because I found so much joy in the variety that was available in growing food at home in the garden. And I would try to talk to people about it who were not passionate gardeners, or if I met someone who was maybe a gardener but who didn't grow heirlooms or didn't grow from seed, and I would find that like glazed over look. I've talked about this a lot before, and I just felt like maybe I was the only one. And when I did my first garden tour in 2018, I actually said in that first garden tour, I won't bore you guys with the varieties. And I was just shocked at the response that so many people said, no, we want to know the varieties. Tell us the varieties. Tell us what you think about them. I have found so much joy in sharing this exact topic with you because it is something I'm passionate about. Now, you can grow a great garden without a bunch of variety. That is 100% true. You don't have to grow 50 different types of tomatoes. You don't have to grow heirlooms. You can go buy started plants at a local store. Growing a variety of things, growing unusual things that are not something that I can just easily go get at the grocery store, that has been the insurance that I needed against myself, because whenever gardening starts kicking my butt about July, when it gets really hot and, you know, the plants are struggling with the heat, I'm struggling with the heat, and the pests are out, you know, in full force, I really don't want to go to the grocery store and see the food I'm fighting for in my garden for sale at the grocery store for 99 cents a pound. Now, I know the homegrown stuff's going to taste better. I'll know where it is. It's better for the earth. All those things stand true. But I'm just telling you that I feel very discouraged when I go to the grocery store and see that. So I like to grow things that if I don't stick it out and do the hard work, I'm not going to get to experience. And that's where a lot of these varieties come in. So before I go into my list, which is broken down by type, I want to cover a topic that has come up in the past whenever I discuss that. And that is, what about zones and regions, and will the things that you grow there in Central Arkansas Zone 7B work for my garden in Michigan or in Texas or in, you know, California or in Colorado or whatever? Just, I'm trying to think of just like a real array of climates. Just because I am in the climate that I'm in doesn't mean that that's the only place that these things are going to grow well. Now, whenever you read about zones, like for instance, my zone is 7B. Some of you may live in countries where the zone chart doesn't even apply. That is a thing that is primarily in the United States. I think the UK at this point kind of goes off the zone chart, but like in Australia, they don't. Basically, what the zone chart is describing is the extreme low for your region. That's the only thing that the zone chart denotes. So like for zone 7, that means the coldest that it ever gets here is 0 degrees Fahrenheit to like 10 degrees Fahrenheit. That's -17 to -12 Celsius. So when I know my zone, I know what will be perennial here. I know that, for instance, I can grow an artichoke plant and it's not going to die in the winter because it's not going to get cold enough to kill it. I can have a fig tree here and it's not going to get cold enough outside to kill it. I cannot grow banana plants. I grow banana plants during the summer and they get really big and pretty, but they'll never bear fruit because it gets cold enough here to kill those. So being in zone 7, like I can't grow tropical things, but a lot of things are perennials for me. A lot of herbs and different things that are frost hardy varieties. So when people start looking at seeds and they start thinking, well, but can I grow that in my zone? Most vegetable plants, whenever you're talking about annuals, that you're going to start this seed at the beginning of the season, you are going to harvest it within the first year or the first season, and then the winter's going to come and then you're going to start over the next season. In most cases, your zone really doesn't have anything to do with that because you're talking about growing this stuff within one growing season. What you really need to know is the length of your growing season, which is to say from your last frost date in the spring to your first frost date in the fall. So obviously the colder the zone gets, you're looking at a shorter growing season. Whereas I have like a 200 something day growing season here in Arkansas. In more northern climates in the zone, zones 4 and 5, some people are getting up into like 100-day growing seasons and even more northern than that. The thing with zones and why that gets confusing is there are people in zone 7 also in Washington State or in Colorado along the East Coast that they have the same average low temperature as me, but they have much shorter growing seasons than I do, or in some cases longer growing seasons than I do. So you can't really determine growing these annuals based off your zone. You really need to know the length of your growing season. I'm going to talk about some peppers, where if you live in a place with a really short growing season, you might need some season extension there. You might need a greenhouse or cold frames or high tunnel in order to be able to grow peppers because you need to add some days to your frost-free growing season. Or you might have to start things indoors, very far in advance. So I have like a friend, Goldshaw Farms, he lives in Vermont, and he doesn't even bother growing peppers because he has such a short growing season. It would just take so much extra work to get those to grow there. When I'm talking about the varieties that work for me, you really need to think, do I have the time, the frost-free time required to grow this thing? Not really worry so much about your zone. And understanding that helps you understand that maybe you are in a place with a much shorter growing season than me. It doesn't mean you can't grow this stuff. You might just have to start it earlier or provide it some sort of protection. Now, with that explained, it is true that some varieties are more apt to succeed in different climates. Like for instance, there's a tomato called the Arkansas Traveler tomato. It was developed here in my home state where I'm gardening. Now I grow tomatoes, all different kinds. I grow Russian tomatoes. I grow tomatoes that were bred by Wild Boar Farms in California. I grow all kinds of tomatoes that are specifically geared towards northern climates, short season climates. I love to grow all different kinds, and I have plenty of time. I can grow any of those tomatoes. But I will tell you that the Arkansas Traveler tomato typically stays healthier longer than the rest in my extremely wet and humid and hot climate because it was bred for this climate. Now, the others produce a lot. I still get a lot of fruit off of them, so they're totally worth growing. And the Arkansas Traveler tomato, I don't find it to be super extraordinary. I don't think that it's necessarily the best tasting tomato or one that totally like woos me in the garden. I don't think it's beautiful, but I still grow it just because it does so well here. So you'll see there might be things that are more prone to your climate if you live in a really dry place, if you live in a really hot place, if you live in a place with a short season, you might want to get something that fruits sooner or saves longer or whatever. There are different attributes that different plants are going to have, and some just may do better in your region. And I think it's good to find those things out. I think it's good to ask the people who live around you, what are your favorite varieties to grow? But one thing you will find is that you might have somebody in Louisiana that loves to grow the Rutgers tomato, or somebody in Colorado that loves to grow the Creole tomato. I mean, people are going to have their favorites, and it might not be because it was developed in that area. And I have just a personal stance on this, which I'll share, and I think it's a good one to adopt. I don't ever take anybody's word for it when they say, I absolutely hated this variety. It was awful. It did terrible for me. I just don't listen to that. Like, I want to have that negative experience myself before I write off a variety. And there are varieties that I've had negative experiences of, they get blight really bad, or they die really fast, or they just never do very well here. They never produce very much. And I'll try them one year, and if I really, really don't like them, a lot of times I won't grow them again. Sometimes I'll go ahead and try them again before I say, I'm not going to grow this variety anymore. But even still, if I ever tell people I don't grow that variety anymore, that is not me telling you that you shouldn't grow that variety. There are too many variables that go into gardening in order to write off a variety just because someone else has a bad experience. They might not be gardening the same way I am. Were they growing it in raised beds in central Arkansas, watering on the same schedule as I do and giving it the same measure of attention that I do? No, they weren't. So I'm going to let something fail for me before I decide that it's a failure. So since it is a weird year and seed sourcing might be just a little bit off, I do encourage you to write any of these down. I'm going to put the spelling up on the screen so you don't have to discern my Southern girl accent on some of these things. I'm sure I'll mispronounce some of them. That's just welcome to Roots and Refuge Farm. I'm going to say some stuff wrong, but write them down. And if it's something you'd like to try, I'm not encouraging you to go buy 1 billion seed packets you don't have space to grow, but maybe you could trade some seeds and get a few seeds of these things and try them. And if you do like them, then maybe make a space for them in your garden permanently in the future. So we're just going to jump in from the top and talk about some different varieties of things, and I've broken these down based on category. Now there are other things that I'll always grow. For instance, I'll always grow Chinese cabbage. I love Chinese cabbage, but I don't have a variety of Chinese cabbage that I feel particularly married to. Like, I'm still trying different varieties, and a lot of times to me I just haven't met something that I didn't like. Like, I always grow Swiss chard, but I didn't necessarily include a variety of Swiss chard in this because there's nothing outstanding to me personally about any variety that makes me feel like it's more special than another one. So this list that I'm talking about, my must grow varieties, this is not a exhaustive list of the things that I must grow in my garden. These are specific varieties of plants that I love. So starting out talking about herbs, I do have a really extensive amount of herbs in my gardens. I have sage, I have thyme, I have oregano, marjoram, chives, all of those, mint, lemon balm, all of those are here. They come back every year. Don't have specific varieties, but I have them all, and I obviously grow them all every year. And I will always have those things in my garden, but I don't have to replant them every year, so I didn't really include varieties on this. I wrote down a few different kinds of basil. I love basil. It is an absolute must-have in the garden. I like that basil is so versatile. You can use it for so many things. There are different things that I've read in different books about how basil is a great companion plant. They say, and I don't understand the science behind this, but they say if you plant your basil near your tomatoes, it makes your tomatoes taste better. I don't really know. I know I like to eat tomatoes with basil. Like, I like to take both of them in the kitchen and put them together and eat them. So I definitely do grow those, not always right next to each other. But there are 3 different types of basil that are my must grows. I have a lot of other ones I do grow, but these 3 types I definitely want in my garden every year. The first one is Genovese basil, which is your really classic, kind of like a sweet, dark green leaf basil. I love Genovese basil. I use it in all kinds of stuff, making pesto, putting it in all sorts of pastas, putting it in salads, putting it in lemonade. I love just a great classic sweet basil. But there was a new one to me last year. It was my first time really successfully growing it, and it 100% made my must grow list. And it's this lettuce leaf basil that it has these huge leaves. I think there were leaves on this basil last year that got to be about this big. And what I would do with those is I would tear them up in salads with like baby greens to eat salad, and then also make wraps with them. And I loved it so much. So the lettuce leaf basil made an always place in my garden. I also always grow dark opal basil, which is a purple one. And if you've not tried different kinds of basil before, they can have such a wide array of flavor. There's also cinnamon and lemon basil and lime basil and so many different kinds. And the dark opal basil has a sharper, more kind of herbaceous flavor. It's not as sweet, and it's not as pronounced in what you would classically call like a basil flavor. It's more almost medicinal tasting, I guess. But I really like it in sauces, things that you kind of maybe want a more punchy flavor. It's just slightly more spicy. And what I like to do with all the basils in my garden, and I do grow other varieties, these are just my 3 must grows, is at the end of the season, whenever I've got an excess, because I plant way more than I actually need. Once it is kind of getting where it's overwhelming and I have a ton of it, I will dry all of it and mix it together. I'll just dry all of it and crumble it all together, and I'll end up with a basil blend that has like 4 or 5 different kinds, and it's so good. It's like one of my favorite things to use in the kitchen. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was flowers, and I am constantly touting the value of having a diversely planted garden. I love using flowers in the garden to bring pollinators in, to make a beautiful space, especially if you're organically gardening, which I am. I don't put any chemicals whatsoever in my garden. And so I like to make a place for beneficial insects to be at home so they can help take care of the pests that I don't want. And so these are kind of like my must grow companion plants. First, nasturtiums. I will grow any variety of nasturtiums I can get my hands on. Namely, I love the variegated nasturtiums, and there are a few different kinds of them, but they're edible. They have kind of like a slight wasabi flavor to them. They're just like slightly spicy, so they're really great to throw in salads or in fish tacos, and they also serve the purpose of being really beautiful and being great for pollinators. Also, sunflowers. I always grow sunflowers in the garden, not just a ton of them, but in the corner of the beds, I'll tuck in some seeds for some really tall sunflowers, like Titan sunflowers or Mammoth sunflowers. Those are a couple of the ones I've done over the last few years. And I love having those beautiful tall sunflowers. I think they serve as a really beautiful anchor for the garden. Of course, they make the bees really happy. I don't usually save the seeds because the birds come and eat them, but they leave my tomatoes alone when they're eating the sunflower seeds, so I just let them. If you wanted to save the seeds, you could grow something like a Mammoth. You can save those seeds, and you just put a pillowcase over the head before they ripen. Another really great companion plant as far as bringing in pollinators is cosmos. Again, I'm really not picky to the variety. I like all the cosmos I've found. I'm excited this year to grow some double click cosmos, which are kind of big frilly flowers, kind of reminiscent of poppies. And that is just a good companion plant to bring in the pollinators and just to add some beauty to the garden. I really love calendula for the same reason. The cool thing about calendula is that it's actually frost hardy. So I am starting calendula now that I will move out to the garden before our last frost date, and it'll survive. It can survive the frost, and it can flower even in this weather. I've got calendula blooming in the greenhouse, the high tunnel right now. My favorite variety, if I had to pick just one, would be Resina, which is just a really basic. But calendula has a lot of properties that are really good for your skin. And Resina has higher occurrences of the oils or whatever is in that's so good for your skin. But there are a lot of different beautiful varieties, and I usually grow a few, but I always grow the Resina, which I dry and infuse into oil for making salves. Another great companion plant is borage, and I usually just plant, your plain old blue borage, but it does come in white, and I have seeds for a variegated borage that I'm excited to try this year. It is an edible flower. I'll be honest, I don't eat it. It's furry. It kind of freaks me out, but it tastes kind of like a cucumber. I've seen really cute things where people have frozen them into ice cubes before. For the most part, the only time I ever eat a borage flower is to show people that you can. The main reason why I grow them is they are big, beautiful plants that the pollinators love. Probably more than any of the other plants I've listed. The pollinators are always all over the borage. Now, I also grow chamomile. The variety of chamomile that is on my must grow list is the Zloty Land chamomile. That's one I'm probably saying wrong. It's a Polish variety. I've grown multiple chamomile varieties, but that one has just done best for me. It always reseeds, it spreads, it gets really big, it stays really healthy. I get to harvest lots and lots of flowers off of it, which I dry and use for tea. I love chamomile tea in the evenings. And that variety I've just had the most success with. Also under the flowers, zinnias, specifically the queen lime zinnias, which there's the red heart and the orange heart, and then there's the complete lime zinnias. That whole collection of zinnias is my most favorite. They're so romantic. They're like these muted kind of vintage colors, and I love them so much. But I've also never met a zinnia that I didn't like. So this year I'm going to be planting a lot of zinnias. I was able to snag a few different varieties from Floret Farms, Restock, and I'm really excited to have those. Zinnias are beautiful cut flowers for the table. They're so easy to grow, and again, they bring those pollinators into the garden, which we really want. Now, I actually have this listed under flowers, which it's really not. It is a basil, but it's not really a true basil. Holy basil, Tulsi, sacred basil, all the same thing. My seeds originally came from In My Gardener, my holy basil seeds. It is, at this point, it just reseeds in my garden. I do not plant holy basil. It just comes up on its own. One is very good medicinal herb. It's great for tea and has lots of wonderful properties that are worth growing it for. But again, it's a beautiful addition to the garden. It smells wonderful, and it makes the pollinators really happy. I just didn't list it with the other basils because if you're growing that expecting it to put it in your spaghetti sauce, you're going to be sorely disappointed because that's not what it's for. So next, beans. Let's talk about beans. Now I'll tell you, I do not grow dried beans. I have 5 sons. In order to make dinner for that many people who are that hungry, it takes a lot of something, and I have not found dried beans to be the kind of thing that is very lucrative for me to grow. I would just have to grow so many of them. So all the beans I'm talking about, I harvest young as green beans or snap beans. And we eat these fresh. I will freeze them, I will can them. A lot of times when the harvest is first starting to come in or it's dwindling down and I'm only getting like a handful at a time, I'll dehydrate those. I'll just cut them up and dehydrate them to throw in like a soup mix. And all of these can work for that. The first one is dragon tongue bush beans. I grow them every year. Those are the first heirloom seeds I ever ordered for my first garden, which failed miserably. I have since then, I've grown them every year that I've had a garden. And so they're kind of dear to my heart at this point. I think they're really beautiful. They do really well for me. They're not necessarily my favorite bean. They're really neat because they're streaky and lovely, but when you cook them, they just turn plain green. So they're, the novelty of it wears off really quick in a pot of boiling water. For me, it's just the reminiscent fact of the matter that they've been in every garden I've ever had. Another variety is Tanya's Pink Pod. Now, when I first started growing these, a friend of mine sent me about 6 seeds, and I grew them and saved seeds over the years. I think now the seeds are becoming more easy to get. It used to be that you could not find them anywhere, but I think that it's getting to be where they are actually available. I think Southern Exposure Seed Company sells them. I want to say that's where I have a pack of seeds from, but I've just saved them out of my garden every year. And they're a hot pink bean. They do cook to green, but it's just really neat because they are genuinely a hot pink bean, and I think they're really cool. They produce really well, and they taste like good green beans. Another one that I love is purple potted pole beans. Now, dragon tongue is a bush that sends off some runners. Tanya's Pink Pod is a true bush, no runners. They just grow in little, 18-inch compact plants. The purple potted pole bean is a climber, and so it's going to climb on whatever trellis you put it near. It can get 8 feet. The plants can get 8 feet tall. And they are really intensely good producers. They produce a deep, rich purple potted bean. They're not terribly stringy, but if they get big, they do get stringy. I'll tell you that. I like to harvest them young, like when they are about the width of my pinky finger. I prefer to get them smaller like that. They can get big, and they'll get like 5-6 inches long, but you'll have to string them in order for them to be very tasty to eat. But I really like them. They're super productive. They are pretty, being purple, and they just grow really well. I mean, they will take over whatever trellis I put them on and just produce like crazy. I'll have to pick them every single day because they produce so much over the course of about a month and a half. I think it's Kalima is what it's called, and they are a bush type that is you harvest them young, and they're very thin. Again, they're like pencil thin, and they're tender, and they're not real stringy, and they produce really well. If I grow one of my long beds 48 feet, and if I grow that entire bed with one single row of these like Kalima bush beans, I will harvest bushels of beans off of that row. And so I feel pretty good about that. And they also are bush beans, so they, you know, you don't have to have trellising for them. You can just grow them in a row. Another pole bean that I grow here and I like is rattlesnake pole beans. That is one that is highly suggested for humid areas. All the other beans that I've mentioned, I've never noticed them struggle with the humidity. I've never noticed any fungal issues with them or any sort of like mildews. Those are usually the issues you have when you're dealing with humidity. And so I've been told so many times, you gotta go rattlesnake beans, you live in the South, they love the heat and the humidity. But I haven't noticed the other ones like hating the heat and the humidity, so I'm not sure about that. But I grow the rattlesnakes. They produce pretty well. They're neat looking, they're streaky, and they're kind of similar into production as the purple potted pole beans. They grow on a trellis, they take it over, and they produce a lot of beans. All of these are very similar to me. I don't notice any of them being like extraordinarily more tasty than the other one. And I've tried a lot of other kind of beans. I didn't hate them, but I have not had a green bean that I was just like, wow, this is the best green bean I've ever had. To me, they are all fairly similar, and I like them all. It's more about texture for me. If they stay tender and they don't get really stringy, that's really what I'm looking for in a good green bean. Another bean to note is the Chinese noodle bean. So this is something that's always in my garden, notably grown on arched trellises down, and they're very lovely. I do always grow these. I always grow at least one trellis of them, the red and the green. They're just called Chinese noodle beans. There are other varieties of long beans called asparagus beans and Thai long beans, different things like that. I've not grown those because since I got my original little pack of Chinese noodle beans, I've been saving seeds off of those for 5 years and I've never had to buy another seed for them. The thing with the Chinese noodle beans that you need to understand is they are not the same as green beans. Their texture is very different. The Chinese noodle beans have just a really different texture. They do have some meat to the pod, but like when you bite them, they're almost like squeaky, if that makes sense. So the thing with Chinese noodle beans that you want to do when you're cooking those is you don't boil them. So they're really good in like stir fries. If you're going to boil them, you boil them for like less than a minute. And then you just throw them in a stir fry and stir fry them the rest of the way. When I've canned them, because I know that you don't want to boil them because they get waterlogged and they just get kind of weird. When I can them, I usually actually pickle them and just make a like spicy pickled bean, puts lots of garlic in it, and they're really neat because they're long and you can twirl them around in the mason jar and just make a really pretty product. But I do grow them, but to me, I just consider the Chinese noodle beans and the green beans a different thing. All right, so the next category is beets. I didn't write down a ton of varieties of beets. The one beet that really like stands out to me that I really like growing year after year is the bull's blood. And I've had other ones in the past that I might have even said at one point, these are my must grows. But what I've found is if I don't plant a certain kind of beet, I don't usually like pine after it or anything. So the bull's blood beet, they have these like really good red greens, and you can pick off some of the greens young and put them in a salad, and that's kind of nice. The thing I like the most about the bull's blood beets is they have like a lot of juice in them, and it's this super dark red rich juice, hence the name bull's blood. But I like juicing beets, and so they seem really good for that. I have read that they are the highest occurring vitamin A in any beet because of that dark red, and that they have a lot of antioxidants in them. I don't know, I've never tested my beets for that, but that's the variety. If I was just gonna have to grow one, that would be the one that I would grow. Next, carrots. I also, again, I like to grow a lot of different kinds of carrots. I'm always trying new carrots. And a lot of times I just feel kind of like, any carrots will do. Lots of different varieties. There are 3 varieties that stand out to me that I like to have. The first one is Cosmic Purple. And it may be that I've been growing it for so long that I love it. But it's just always done really well for me. I've always had a lot of success with it. It has that purple outside and orange inside, which is nice. It will turn your food a little purple, not overwhelmingly so, but like if you make chicken noodle soup and you put Cosmic Purple carrots in it, it's gonna have like a purplish grayish tinge to it. It doesn't bother me, but it is worth noting. that might be something to consider. But I like it. It's kind of got that more piney flavor profile, like a parsley-ish flavor profile. It's not super sweet. It's just like a really good, strong, basic parsley-ish carrot flavor. Another variety that I like is the Kyoto Red. I actually tried the Kyoto Red at Baker Creek a couple of years ago. I went and toured there and we did like a carrot tasting in the greenhouse. And the Kyoto Red, it's like a dark reddish orange carrot and it's really sweet. So if you like sweet carrots, that's a good one to go with. The last variety that I'll mention is Black Nebula. And this was a carrot that came, you know, into popularity a few years ago. And it is the darkest purple and the most occurring anthocyanins in a carrot. It is really neat. So it is like dark purple all the way through, stain your fingers. I just think it's really cool. The flavor is good. I actually think the Kyoto Red probably tastes better than the Black Nebula. I don't find it to be as sweet, but it's really cool for juicing. I mean, you could dye stuff with this. It's got that much color to it. Now let's talk about cucumbers. This I actually have a pretty good opinion on because I've had some really positive experiences with different cucumbers. So the first one I have fallen in love with and has earned an always place in my garden is the silver slicer cucumber. I got the seeds from Hudson Valley a couple years ago. Actually, it was one that the owner of the company, Ken, suggested to me. He said, this is a great cucumber. I think you're going to love it. And I absolutely did. I grew 4 plants on one of my arch trellises, 2 on each side, and I don't even know how many pounds of cucumbers I harvested off of that one trellis of these cucumbers. I would come out and fill my big basket up on a daily basis. I made so many pickles out of them and they did really great for that. I was able to harvest them young and make pickles and I really liked that, but I even let some of them get really big to see how they were, and the skin stayed soft, didn't get bitter. They're white, so they're kind of neat looking. Even when they got larger, I was able to juice them. Just if I had to grow one cucumber, it would be the silver slicer, and I will continue to grow it. I actually have the seeds right here. You can see the seed pack, and they've got the picture on the back here. But I love this cucumber so much, and I'm actually really looking forward to having it again because I have missed it since it stopped producing. It also produced into the heat longer. Like all the other cucumber varieties in my garden had dried up. They tend to do that when it gets really hot. They'd gotten all crispy and stuff, and the cucumbers had started getting bitter, and the silver slicer was just still cranking out great tasting cucumbers completely unbothered. Now, in the past, I have always grown like a Chicago pickling cucumber or a national pickling cucumber, just one of those basic varieties of pickling cucumbers that are often suggested. And I'm not 100% this year that I will. I might go ahead and throw one of those in for good measure, but I don't know that it's necessary with the silver slicer. And frankly, last year I had so many silver slicers that were delicious that when the other national pickling in Boston and Chicago pickling cucumbers, I don't remember which variety, I usually grew one of those every year. When they started getting really bitter, they were getting thrown to the chickens and the pigs, whereas I was still using the silver slicer. So I don't even know that I'll grow those. I wrote them down because they've been on my must grow list for so long, but I think they might have gotten replaced. I do still really like the Parisian pickling cucumber because it's really small. It only gets, like you pick it this big for gherkins, and it only gets like this big before it starts really filling out and it'll get really fat and stuff. But it's good. It has a really good flavor. They produce fast. So I think I can't remember how many days the variety is, something like 45 or 50 days, whereas the silver slicer does take a little longer than that. And so I still grow those and I still like them. They're a good option if you're growing on limited space because the Parisian pickling plants, I think they only get like 3 or 4 feet. I've grown them on multiple trellises and they don't get very long, and they are smaller cucumbers. So if you were growing in containers or like on a patio or in a smaller garden, I think it would be a good option. And I usually do also grow some sort of slicer variety. Like the Market More is one that I've gone to multiple years, or Straight 8 is another one. But again, I just don't really know for sure that it's that necessary given how well the silver slicer does. The reason I grow the slicers is because pickling cucumbers have less water content so they're for pickling. They have like a firmer skin, a flesh that holds up to the process of canning. Whereas slicer cucumbers are typically more water content, and so they're good for slicing into salads, eating fresh, or juicing. And usually I grow a pickling cucumber and a slicer cucumber. I found the silver slicer to be so versatile that I didn't really find a huge need for my big slicer varieties that I usually grow. So I may grow a couple of those plants for good measure, but man, I'm sold on the silver slicer. And lastly, I have to mention this here in the cucumber section, but it sort of is a crossover, the Armenian white yard long. It's not a cucumber, it's technically a melon. It is marketed more as a cucumber, and I think that if you buy like the started plants that Burpee sells, it'll say cucumber on it. That's something I've grown in the past, and I've harvested it young. Now they get really big. Like they very quickly are gonna get to be 12 to 18 inches, and if you harvest them young when they're about this big around, the skin is super soft, they're really mild flavored, and they're just like a cucumber even though they're technically a melon. However, this last year I had some that I just left on the plant to see what would happen, and in the past I have pickled them. I've turned them into pickles, sliced them and pickled them and canned them, turned them into bread and butter pickles, turned them into sour pickles. And they're great. They work great for that. They're really tasty just eating fresh. They're just very mild and sweet, and their skins don't get bitter even in the heat. But this last year I let them grow and develop a rind and get harder and really like live out their full melon self. And they got to be about this big. They were a yard long almost, and they were very melony. And I thought, let me see if these are even worth anything. Because sometimes, you know, like if something's marketed to you, this is better as a cucumber, it really is better as a cucumber. But man, they're very mild. They don't have a ton of flavor to them. But they are mildly sweet and like great melon texture. And what I ended up doing with those, which I thought was really cool, is I ended up scooping the flesh out, blending it with some like vanilla Greek yogurt, which did have some sweetener in it. You could do non-sweet and add honey or something like that if you want to. And freezing it as popsicles. And it was really good. Like it was very refreshing. Obviously it didn't have a ton of sugar in it. And I was able to make this treat for my kids out of this mild melon. And the things were massive. I mean, the amount of food that was in one was really, really cool. I actually will continue to grow that because it is good as a cucumber, but it actually has use as a melon as well. And I think you could probably even find other uses for it, maybe making some like cold salads or different things like that. I just thought it was really cool, and I think that we should give the Armenian white yard long cucumber melon a little more credit for being awesome. Now let's move on to eggplants. Eggplants are some that I've grown for a long time, not with a ton of success. I've had a couple of years that were inexplicably wonderful eggplant years, and other times that they really struggled. But there are a few varieties that really stand out to me. The first one is Antigua, which my first eggplant experience that I was like really fell in love with eggplant was back before I was gardening, but I was shopping at farmers markets, and there was a farmer there that was selling a fairy tale eggplant, which that is an F1 hybrid. And the Antigua is the first heirloom variety that was very similar to the fairy tale. I also like the fairy tale, but the Antigua is like a white and purple streaked eggplant, and I really like it, as well as the ping tongue and the Casper. I use them all the same. I typically like my eggplant in like a stir fry, or I'll do some sort of like bake with it in the oven, slicing maybe some tomatoes and zucchini and onions and just baking it all down till it sort of like caramelizes and melts together with some oil and garlic and stuff. And all three of those do really well. I like all three of those because they do well being stir fried also. And I should also note, I really like the Black Beauty eggplant. It's more of like a classic big purple eggplant. It's a little more compact in shape, and I really enjoy it. It's done pretty well for me here. That's one I've had more success with over the years. All right, ground cherries. Now we talk a lot about ground cherries here on this channel. It is one of Jeremiah's favorite things in the garden, so we always have ground cherries. My children love ground cherries. Ground cherries are like a a small cherry-sized tomatillo. They grow in a husk. They're the size of a, cherry tomato, or a little smaller than a cherry tomato. And the texture is similar-ish to a tomato, but not quite. They don't have a lot of gel in them. They're more solid inside, and they have really small little seeds. And then, of course, they grow in a husk. We've grown a few different kinds of ground cherries. The first one we ever grew was pineapple. And so you'll hear Jeremiah reference pineapple ground cherries often. However, we grew the Aunt Molly's as well and found them to be incredibly similar. I wouldn't have been able to tell them apart. Like, if you mixed them all together, I couldn't tell you which was which. And they start out small, and the plants start really small, and then eventually they start like really picking up and growing. But they're slow starters. You cannot put the seeds deep. Now, whereas tomatillos need 2 plants in order to pollinate, ground cherries do not have to have a second plant to pollinate. So at this point, they really reseed very readily, and I still start some from seeds and grow them, but there will be ground cherry plants just all over our property at this point. And I don't know what kind they are. Pineapple, Aunt Molly's, one of the other ones we've grown. Kale. You'll know I'm going in alphabetical order here. I'm not going in any order of things I like or what season they grow or anything like that. So I love kale. I grow a lot of kale, way more than I need. I give it to my animals. I have excess kale. It's just really easy for me to grow, especially when I'm growing it not in the summer. I do not grow kale in the summer. It doesn't like the heat, but I can grow it all the way through my winter with minimal coverage, and it does great. Now, I grow a lot of different kinds of kale, and anytime that a seed company releases a new variety, I try it because I really like kale. I don't like it raw, but I do like it cooked in soups, and we juice it. We make kale chips. I like to saute it, fry it with some eggs. I like kale in all of those applications, but I don't really eat it raw unless it's really young and still soft. But the 3 varieties that are always in my garden, I've got a bunch of them right now in my greenhouse, are lacinato, which is dinosaur kale, and it's also called Nero da Toscana, which is like Tuscan cabbage. I love how it looks. It's very hearty. I like the flavor of it. It's just a good kale. I also like classic blue curled Scotch, which is more like the kale that you see in grocery stores. It's very good, especially when it's grown in cold weather. It's much sweeter. And the variety that I think is my #1 favorite kale variety is called Ragged Jack. And the thing that I love about Ragged Jack is it grows outdoors here through my winter. It can get snowed on, it can get iced on, it can become extremely cold, and it lives straight through it. It's very hardy in my winter, and I love the flavor of Ragged Jack. It's kind of ragged, it's curly, and it's just really pretty. It's a pretty plant, and it does really well. Lettuces, I am not super married to a whole lot of lettuces. Now, I like lettuce. I grow a lot of lettuce. I'm constantly trying new lettuces, and usually I like them all very well. I get like muslin mixes from seed companies, different baby green mixes, and I usually like just about any lettuce grown as a baby green. Some of them, when they start getting bigger into heads, you deal with bitterness or whatever, but I really think that has a lot more to do with how it's grown than it actually has to do with the variety. Because if we have like an unusually warm snap, all the lettuce gets bitter. If I'm not watering it a whole lot, the flavor gets a little weird. And so I think it really, the method of growing your lettuce really impacts the flavor in a massive way. But the 2 varieties, if I had to say, I'm just going to grow these 2, it would be Black-Seeded Simpson and Marvel of 4 Seasons. Those 2 lettuces I have found have had really consistently good flavor. The Black-Seeded Simpson I actually grew out of a mix last year and very, very much enjoyed it. Next, let's talk about personal melons. Also grown a whole lot of little personal melons, being that I have so many arched trellises in my garden. Melons are one of my favorite things to grow on small melons that you can grow on the vertical supports just using some pantyhose to tie them up. A lot of them are okay or even good, but I don't feel just a ton of like, I gotta have that one. They're pretty interchangeable to me, and I've tried many, many different kinds. The 2 that are like, I'm always gonna grow them no matter what, is the Kajari melon. That melon is just one of my favorites. It's beautiful. It's a melon that originated in Punjab, and I have a history with it. It's something that I just really was dead set on growing and really worked hard to grow, and now I always give it space in my garden. It's an orange small melon. It does really well in the trellises, and it kind of has like a muskmelon almost flavor to it, green flesh, and I just really like it. And then the Kiku chrysanthemum melon. So this one's kind of interesting. It's a really small, light, like white melon, which I originally grew because the Baker Creek seed catalog said that it tasted like Greek yogurt and pears. And I was like, I just need to know what this tastes like. It's just kind of mild, got a really good texture to it. The reason why I will always grow it is my kids think it is the coolest thing in the world because it is a one-person melon. You're not, you know what I mean? It's really little. It's about the size of a baseball. And it's a really thin rind flesh and soft flesh melon. And my kids come down and they pull them off and they just hit them up against the side of the garden bed to break it in half and just eat it right there in the garden. And they think that's very, very cool. They're extremely productive. And so that's one that I really enjoy growing. Okra is a plant that I love. It is more popular in the South, and that it definitely does better in warmer climates. It really just stands up to a lot of neglect. It can handle really poor soil, so it's a good thing to grow if you're trying to like establish a garden space because it can help break through the soil, and it just can handle really poor soil. There are a few varieties. Again, I'm not a discriminatory okra grower. I grow a lot of different varieties. I like a lot of different varieties, but I do have a couple that I really like growing. The Texas Hill Country or the Alabama Red. Now, there's two separate varieties that are very similar. They're really short and squatty, and I love them both. Either one will do just fine. I usually actually do grow both of them, but if I had, you know, if I had limited space, one would be okay because they're very similar. And my favorite thing about the Alabama Red is we love fried okra. That's one of our favorite summer treats. And when you slice that up to fry it, you get these big fat medallions because they're such squatty okra pods. And they just have fantastic flavor. There's just very strong okra flavor. But I like the burgundy and the Clemson spineless. Those are two different varieties. The burgundy is like a dark red, skinny, long pod. And the Clemson spineless is the most popular okra. If you go buy started plants or you buy seeds at just like a box store, Clemson spineless is usually the okra they have. It's one of those things that it's the most popular for a reason. It's just, it doesn't get as woody as fast, and it's just really good. Now I'm talking about like green peas in this, and you can grow peas for shelling, which I don't actually do that very much, just the time constraints, and peas have to be shelled. And then you have to do something with them really fast because the minute that you take those off the plant, they start converting their sugars to starches. And so if you've ever grown peas and you shelled them and you stuck them in your fridge for 2 days and then you ate them and you thought, these taste terrible, it's not the peas' fault. It was at that point all starch and no sugar. Like if you're gonna grow shelling like green English peas, keep that in mind. However, the telephone pea is a really good shelling pea. I've grown them some and then we've just eaten them fresh, but I just have never gotten into really shelling them. Kind of the same thing with the dried beans. It's just you have to grow a lot for a family my size. But I do love peas for the pods, and we just love to eat the pea pods. We eat them fresh in the garden the most, or we pick them and eat them on a salad or just as a snack. The kids eat a ton of pea pods when they're in season, and they're also good in stir fries and stuff like that. But my two favorite varieties, they're very similar, are the Magnolia Blossom tendril peas and the Sugar Magnolia purple tendril peas, and they're similar. They have these little curly cues that come off, and they're just really beautiful plants. They taste really good. I've tried a lot of other ones, and I actually, again, have not grown one that I was like, oh, this is bad. I just like those because of how pretty they are. I think they taste really good, and they're very productive. Peppers. Let's talk about hot peppers first. I do not grow super hot peppers. Nobody in my house eats them, so I am not your girl for stuff like that. I know some of you are crazy and you love those ghost peppers and those things that make you feel like you're gonna die, but I just don't grow them. I don't want my kids to eat them and somebody end up hurt. just don't grow them. So the hottest thing that I grow is a habanero. I always grow habaneros, like a plant of them, for making peach habanero jam and, you know, some hot sauces. And so I'm not super picky about the habanero I grow. Any of them is fine for me. I grow Craig's Grande jalapeno. That is my favorite jalapeno to grow. They get really big. And I usually also grow the Tam jalapeno because they are so productive. They grow so many peppers. They do really well. They have really good flavor. And the Craig's Grande, I end up using those whenever I'm going to do like stuffing and stuff like that. But the Tam are nice because they're not massive. The thing with the Craig's Grande, sometimes those peppers are like this big around. And if you're just trying to make slices to like pickle, to have pepper slices on things, you might not want them to be that big. So I do the Tam as well. I also always grow cayenne peppers, just like the long, thin cayenne. I've tried other varieties like purple ones, but I end up coming back to the long, thin cayennes. Just grow them and dry them and crumble them up. I dehydrate them and then grind them down to a powder to make our own cayenne pepper powder. I like to grow the fish pepper, and I'll always grow that one. It's such a beautiful plant. It's variegated and just very lovely. It's like a medium hot pepper. For those of you who eat super hot, probably wouldn't find it that hot at all, but I guess kind of similar-ish in heat to like a jalapeno, maybe a little bit. I don't know, I would say it's the same. It's got a different flavor to it, but it's nice in salsas or in hot sauces. A lot of times we'll make a hot sauce or a salsa. We just use a mix of whatever medium hot peppers we have, and the fish pepper ends up in a lot of salsa. I also grow poblanos, which are not super hot at all. They're just like mildly hot, but they're not super hot. And poblanos are just a great versatile pepper. They're really good for roasting and then soaking in oil and then using that oil in cooking just to add pepper flavor to things. And of course, poblanos, if you let them turn colors where they're not green anymore, where they deepen, it's like a dark red, and you smoke them, that's how you get ancho chili powder. And then also poblano peppers are what are often stuffed for like stuffed chilies and stuff like that in Mexican cooking. So poblanos are just a really good versatile pepper, and they grow really well. I really like them. Then I also always grow serranos. They're very similar to a jalapeno in looks. They're skinnier and they're hotter. I would say they're at least twice as hot as a jalapeno, and they can't even be hotter than that. But those are my favorite salsa peppers. And lastly, of the hot peppers that I just must grow are Sugar Rush peach peppers. And they have other colors like red, but I've only ever grown the peach. And they make a fantastic hot sauce. They are pretty spicy. They're spicier than the serranos, but they have like a really good fruity tropical flavor, and so I like making hot sauce with those. Sweet peppers. Now with sweet peppers, I'm calling these sweet, but I'm also referring to mild. Some of these are not necessarily sweet, they're just not spicy. The first one is shishitos. My favorite pepper, hands down. I could eat my weight in shishito peppers every summer. Last year, I think I grew like 4 or 5 plants. It produced a ton. They produced so many peppers. We ate them with dinner multiple times a week, put a hole in them so they don't explode, and then blister them in a hot pan and serve them with like an aioli. I would just make it out of like mayo and garlic and maybe some like citrus juice, lime juice or whatever. And it was so good. Next is the corbaci, which is a Swedish pepper, sweet-ish, not Swedish, sweet-ish pepper. They're long, they turn red, they're kind of curly, they produce very heavily. The way I like to use corbacis is dicing them up in like a breakfast scramble. They have a really good flavor, and I really enjoyed them. Now the arroz con pollo pepper is one that I raved about a few years ago in my garden tours, and I didn't grow it last year because I didn't have seeds for it, and it was sold out everywhere, probably because I talked so well about it and because of the seed shortage and everything last year. The arroz con pollo pepper is a seasoning pepper that is very unique. Arroz con pollo means chicken and rice, and this pepper is, I mean, when you taste it, you're like, it's not sweet, it's not hot. It is definitely a seasoning pepper. It has a very unique flavor, and I really liked it. I thought it was really cool. It was one that took off later. It like didn't do very much till the end of the season, and then I was overrun with them. Next, the habanada, one of my favorite peppers this last year. I grew it in the high tunnel, and they had just such a lovely flavor. This is a pepper that was developed pretty recently, and it's supposed to be like a habanero, but without the heat. I ate those for breakfast almost every morning, and they kind of had just like a sweetness to them that reminded me of fruit. They had a very fruity flavor, very tropical, and I really liked them. Now, I will say towards the end of the season, as the plants got more mature and the weather got like cooler, I noticed that the habaneros took on like more of a musky flavor like later on, rather than so it was really important to harvest those young to get that flavor. Like, I left some of them on the plant too long, and they got I still liked them, but they were not the same thing as when they were like just turning color. That flavor was just fantastically sweet. But if you left it on longer, the walls got a little thinner the more mature they got, and the flavor got just kind of musky, and they weren't as good. The nada-peno, which is another one that was developed like in recent years, which is like a jalapeno with no heat. And I really liked growing those, because I do have some kids that don't like spicy stuff. So if I would make like stuffed jalapeno peppers, I could make some that had no heat in them. Or if we like when we had family here that didn't like the heat, I could make something that didn't have the heat in it. Another thing I did with these is if I was, for instance, I was making like cowboy candy, instead of doing all hot jalapenos, I would do half and half, because one of the things we do with that cowboy candy, which is like candied jalapenos, is we'll like mix it in with cream cheese to make a dip. And if I had half nada-penos, it just wasn't as spicy in that dip. Next is probably the most sweet pepper that I'm mentioning today is the Marconi Red. They're just really thick-walled, red, very sweet peppers, and I really, really like them. I also grew just some basic sweet banana peppers this year. It was the first year that I had done that. I have not really grown banana peppers in the past, and those were probably snacked on in the garden more than most other things. Just anytime we were out there, the kids constantly ate them. I ate them. Like, they're just so good. And then also they were great to pickle. Now, as I was doing this list, I thought, I don't have a bell pepper down. I always grow bell peppers, but I really realized in making this list, I don't have a favorite variety. I guess the California Wonder has ended up in my garden a lot because it's fairly fail-proof. It does really well as the Ozark Beauty. That's another one that I can remember growing a lot. But I cannot honestly tell you this is my favorite because XYZ. Like, they just do okay, and I like them. So, I don't know, if you have a great bell pepper that just blows your mind, please tell me, because I have not fallen in love with one. Alright, just a couple of mentions on a couple of root vegetables. Rutabagas. I grow lots of different varieties of rutabagas. I've liked them all. I would say if I had to pick a favorite, the Navone Yellow has been very good. It's been very consistent. I still like it when it gets really big. It does tend to get more knobbly at that point. Like whenever you boil them and mash them, you're going to have more like harder pieces in it that don't soften as fast the bigger that it gets, but it's still very edible. It's still good. So with radishes, I actually like most radishes. I like them sliced really thin on tacos. When I'm eating raw radishes, I don't tend to eat a lot of them, you know, just like a little bit. But I've pickled radishes and they're really good. And then roasting them is the way that we eat radishes the most. If I had to say a favorite, I would definitely say the French breakfast, which is a variety that grows kind of oblong, and it's red on top and white on bottom. And I've noticed with them that the skin stays really nice and smooth, and they're just good, mild flavor. They're not super spicy. The flavor of a variety is really going to be hindered by whether you're growing it in the cool weather versus the warm weather. If you grew a radish in the summer and you didn't like how spicy it was, try them in the winter. They just have a completely different flavor. But I would say French breakfast. If I just had to grow one radish, that would be the one that I would grow. But I like most all of them. That's just my favorite. And while I'm thinking of root vegetables, I didn't write this down, but turnips are very similar to rutabagas. In some countries, rutabagas are called cabbage turnips or Swedes. But turnips, I typically just grow like a purple top turnip, a real basic one. I've grown a lot of different varieties. I've grown white ones that I really liked, yellow ones. And that's one of those things that I don't have one that I like look forward to growing. I just like turnips. Any of them are great. I like eating them raw, just cutting them up, and you can dip them in like hummus or just eating them raw. They're really good. Or cooked in soups or mashed. I just like all turnips. I don't have a favorite. Summer squash. Summer squash are hard because I deal with squash bugs in such a massive way that I've yet to find a summer squash that is genuinely resistant to the squash bugs. The most long-lived squash that I've ever grown that got really huge and produced a ton of fruit was the Gelber Englisher custard squash. And it's like a patty pan summer squash. And I still grow it. However, I've never had it last as long as that first year that I grew it that it did so well. But I still grow it and it still does pretty well. And I usually get a good harvest before it dies due to squash bugs and borers. I also grow the early golden crookneck because basically my game is with the squash is I can't beat the squash bugs without putting poison on them. I've done all the tricks and I've done the companion planting, but ultimately they win the battle. So my goal is to grow squash that fruits early. Like if it is an early variety, that way I can get a pretty good harvest on it before the plant dies. And so the early golden crookneck is one that I usually grow, as well as some of the others like the round ones. Ron Denise is one, 8-Ball is another. Their flavor is not extraordinary. The only reason why I grow those round ones is because they make food so fast. And another notable one is the Zucchino Rampicante, which is also called Tromboncino. And those are really cool, and they did pretty well with the squash bugs, and I ended up harvesting a lot. The thing with those is they grow really long, and they have like a bulb at the end, and they're real long. And I grew those on arch trellises, and I grew them on the ground, and I liked them a lot. Again, the flavor's on the mild side. It's not like mind-bogglingly strong squash flavor, but they just produce so much food that I will continue to grow those as well. Now with winter squash, again, I deal with squash bugs, and winter squash needs to stay in the ground and stay healthy for a really long time. So as much as I love all of the decorative pumpkins and the beautiful big warded squashes, I've never grown those before because I've just never been able to keep the plants alive long enough. But I do grow spaghetti squash. I'm not picky on the type. I do grow acorn squash, and I'm not picky on the type, and I usually grow some sort of pie pumpkin, and I've done the New England and the sugar pie and like a lot of the more popular ones, and they've all done fine. All of those are on the shorter end of winter squash. Like they take less time than a lot of the others, and I will always grow those, a pie pumpkin and a spaghetti squash and an acorn squash. Butternut squash, that was another one that I always grow, but I'm not picky on the variety. I actually have been erring more on the side of hybrids for those, again, for the ability to stand up to squash bugs. Tomatoes, I am the tomato queen. I've been out here talking so long that I've run out of light, but I cannot stop without talking about my precious tomatoes. I grow a lot of tomatoes, a lot of different varieties that I grow every year, but for the sake of keeping this short, I'm going to tell you the ones that if I had to narrow it down, these are the ones that I would narrow it down to. I have two favorites. People say, what are your favorites of all? And these are the two that if I could only grow two, these would be them. The first one is Dr. Witchy's. I know I'm saying it wrong. I believe it's Weiches or Weishes or Wishes. I don't know. I've had multiple people tell me how to say it, and they're not in agreement. I'm pretty sure it's Weiches. The person from the man who made this hometown told me that that's what it was. But I love this tomato. It's a very good producer. It produces big tomatoes, lots of big tomatoes on the plant, like lots that are over a pound. And they're yellow, they're mild, they're great for a tomato sandwich. I really, really like them. I've found that people who don't like tomatoes like this tomato because it's really meaty. It doesn't have a lot of that gel in it, and it doesn't have that really acidic kick. It's more mild. So my next most favorite tomato is the Paul Robeson tomato. As far as I know, he didn't grow this tomato, but it was named in his honor, and it has a massive following for its amazing flavor. It's like a dark reddish kind of, it's called purple. It's not really a purple tomato, but it's like a real dark red, and it's got like a really rich smoky flavor. The best tomato I've ever eaten was a Paul Robeson tomato that was picked late in the summer on a really dry afternoon, so that attributed to the flavor. And it was so intensely good. And so I will always grow this tomato. They're not all as good as that one was. It really depends on, you know, if it's been raining lately, that flavor is going to be diluted. But that one particular tomato was seriously so good that I had to sit down there in the garden to finish it. I just picked it walking by and took a bite of it and had to sit down. It was so, so good. And it's definitely one of my favorites. And so the Dr. Witchies and the Paul Robeson are like these two. If I only had 2 packs of tomato seeds, these would be it. And I usually save seeds from them as well. But the other like honorable mentions, I'll talk about some of my favorites and why I like them. The Brandywine. Brandywine tomatoes always get sick in my garden, but they were my granddaddy's favorite variety, so I always grow them. They are really good. There's a reason why people love Brandywines. They're just a really good classic red tomato. The Climbing Triple Crop is a really great red variety, just a really good classic one, really good producers. Some of the biggest tomatoes I've ever grown were from Climbing Triple Crop plants, so that one's always in my garden. A few years ago, I had a new one introduced to me called Thornburns Terracotta. I have grown it since then and really enjoyed it. And I will tell you that I have struggled a little bit with it being more prone to blossom end rot than the other ones in the garden. And so it's partially my fault because I didn't have my watering right, but the rain can cause that. However, whenever you have multiple varieties of plants dealing with the same set of circumstances and one variety has an issue more prominently than the others, that's what I mean by it was prone to that. However, the flavor of those tomatoes is so good. They're the only tomatoes that I know of that are that dark, like terracotta color. They're like a deep brownish orange. And they're just so unique that I will always grow them, even though they're a little titchy. The Abe Lincoln. This one is its first year on my must grow list. I grew it last year and it was really good. Just really big classic red tomatoes, great for sandwiches. I mean, I harvested many tomatoes off those plants that were almost 2 pounds. As well as the Italian Heirloom. Now, I will say the Italian Heirloom and the Amish Paste are pretty similar. I've had 2-pound Italian Heirlooms and 2-pound Amish Paste. They're both big ox heart types that are really meaty, and I like growing both of those because you can slice them and eat them fresh on a sandwich. You can just eat them, you know, cut them up and eat them with some salt on them, or they're really great for processing if you're going to make sauce. So, but I use all of these tomatoes for sauce and salsa. I usually just throw them in the oven for a little bit and cook off some of the liquid and drain it off, and then they're all good for that. And then there are 2 by Wild Boar Farms. Brad Gates breeds really neat tomatoes, and the Black Beauty is one of them. Now, the Black Beauty does not wow me with the flavor. Like, it's not the one that I'm growing because it tastes extraordinary. However, it is got this dark, almost black purple skin. Anywhere where it comes in contact with the sun, it's super rich in anthocyanins. And I love growing the Black Beauty to give away because you are never going to find that tomato in a store. It's just really, really neat. And it does have good flavor, but it falls to the wayside to some of these other ones I'm talking about in flavor. But I still think it's worth growing because it's the only one that gets that deep. It's almost black. It's so cool. And then the Large Barred Boar, which is another Wild Boar Farms variety that does have really great flavor. Really beautiful streaking. It's a really great plant. Now, cherry tomatoes, I've got those categorized differently. I do really like Wild Boar Farms cherry tomatoes. Most of my favorites are from him. The blueberry line, which is the blue boarberry, blue goldberry, blue creamberry. I'll always grow those. They're beautiful, but they are also extremely hardy. They're almost always the first to produce in the garden, the first one to be ripe, and as well as the last. When the rest of the tomato plants have given in to blight, those are still producing, and they outproduce everything else in the garden. They're really good flavor. The red one, the blueberry, is more acidic, whereas like the yellow gold one is more mild and sweet. I also really like Berry's Crazy Cherry. It's a multiflora, which means it grows these really big clusters of yellow fruits, and the skin is really thin. You're gonna see that more with yellow varieties and like cream varieties. They tend to have a thinner skin and a milder flavor. That one is slightly more prone to splitting because it has that thin skin, but as long as you make sure you pick them before you water, before it rains, you don't really have to deal with that as much. And I really love the flavor. I find that people who come to my house and eat cherry tomatoes, they comment on the Berry's Crazy Cherry really often. I also really like the Bumblebee series. This is not Wild Boar Farms, but it's Sunrise Bumblebee, I think Pink Bumblebee, and Purple Bumblebee. That series of cherry tomatoes, they're good. They're a little larger than other ones. They're more probably towards a saladette. They're like an ounce each, so they're about this big, whereas other cherry tomatoes are about half that size. And I grow them. They make the basket really pretty and colorful. They taste really good. They don't split super readily, and they're just very productive. And another cherry tomato that is on my must grow, and see, I grow a lot of other cherry tomatoes and I like them, but these are the ones that I would say stand out, is Sun Golds. And that is one that I've been growing for a very long time. It was a hybrid when I first started gardening, but now you can buy like open pollinated stabilized Sun Gold seeds, and they're really sweet, little orange ones, and they do well. And I've tried some others that are like supposed to be similar to Sun Golds, but I've just never found one that I liked as much as that one. All right, last topic, which I don't have just a ton of input on, is watermelons. I've grown quite a few watermelons here, and they all are about the same. Watermelons, I really feel like, are one of those things that the flavor is really heavily going to depend on how much they've been watered and how they're growing, how they're fertilized. The most successful watermelon I have grown, the Desert King is the variety, and we loved that melon. I grew a really massive one. I mean, massive for us. I want to say it was in the range of like 30 pounds or so. And it was really tasty. But we had, I don't know, we grew a lot of different watermelons last year, and they were all really good. I didn't really feel like any of them were so mind-blowing that I had to think I'm always going to grow that. But I probably will continue to grow the Desert King watermelon because I was just so proud of the big one that we had, and the flavor was really good. So I think that I've covered everything that I meant to cover. I'm probably forgetting some stuff. You'll notice I didn't give you any suggestions on broccoli or cabbage or cauliflower. I probably skipped over some different root vegetables. I know I skipped over kohlrabi. All of those things are things that I just don't have an opinion on. I like all the ones that I've grown. I love the variety that is available to us in the garden. I think it has a tremendous amount of value because whereas obviously we're gardening to put food on the table, that is the ultimate goal. If we're honest with ourselves, our interest in something is very valuable. And if you are going to be more interested and more committed to something that, like these unusual varieties that might have flavor or a beautiful look or color that you can't just go buy at the store, that might be what keeps you gardening whenever you run into roadblocks and you might be tempted to give up. So thank you guys for hanging out with me today. I will put the exhaustive list of all the varieties mentioned down below if you'd like to go back and check the spelling of anything, as well as links to some of the seed companies that I like to buy seeds from. If you are looking for any of these particular varieties, just do an internet search. Just put the spelling as I listed in the internet search bar and you'll have some options come up. And also, I encourage you to make a list and do some swapping. You know, find some other gardeners that you can trade with and say, this is what I'm looking for and this is what I have. Because a lot of times you don't need a whole pack of something to try something. You need 5 to 10 seeds, and that's plenty for a home garden. So thank you guys again. I hope this was helpful, and bless you. Until next time.